In today's video, we're going to continue our 2019 NHL offseason plan series, and we're discussing the Washington Capitals, and that's coming up next. Welcome back to Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So welcome to the offseason plan series. If you're new to this series, we break these videos down into 3 segments. Segment 1, we're going to look at the 18-19 season recap here, look at any key team as well as individual player stats and any trades or changes that happen through this team throughout the season. In segment 2, we're going to look at the cap situation overall, take a look at any pending contracts that are up for renewal this summer, and then thirdly, we're going to discuss what moves this team needs to make to get better for next season. Also, if you're new to this series, I'll put a playlist up here in the YouTube cards. We've covered quite a few teams in the NHL now. We're only down to a few left, so check that out. If there's plenty of other teams you haven't caught yet, and if there's a team you're looking for, stay tuned. They'll be coming soon here over the next couple of days to get this series wrapped up. Now let's jump into the 18-19 season recap for the Washington Capitals. So as we know, the Washington Capitals entered the 18-19 season as defending Stanley Cup champions. They finished with a record of 48, 26, and 8 for 104 points. Once again finishing first place with another division title here in the Metropolitan Division. Now, as we've seen, the Washington Capitals, like all the other NHL division winners this season, suffered a first round loss to the upstart Carolina Hurricanes, who ended up going all the way to the conference finals. Now let's take a look at some of the key team stats from this past year, including special teams and goals for and against. The power play was excellent as usual, 20.8%, 12th best in the NHL. Considering what they can put out there in Alex Ovechkin in his office, it's no wonder that power play is excellent year after year. The PK was not real solid this year, 24th best at 78.9%, so that could certainly stand to be improved. Goals for, as usual as well, pretty strong, 278 for 5th best, and goals against were slightly below average in the NHL, 249 for 17th best. Now let's take a look at some of the key player statistics, including their starting goaltending and top scorers. Now once again, we saw starting goaltender Braden Holtby not have the greatest regular season. Obviously, there was a number of years ago where Holtby was putting up solid regular seasons, pretty solid playoff performances too, even though the Capitals couldn't seem to get over the hump past the second round. But last year, obviously, he didn't have a great regular season either, but he really came up in the playoffs. The Capitals elected to start Philip Grubauer in Game 1 of the playoffs last year, but it wasn't long before Holtby took over and ended up taking him the rest of the way. And of course, this year, he came back as a starter, again, even because Grubauer was traded, so there wasn't as much competition in that regard. Backup Phoenix Copley didn't do a half-bad job as well, but Holtby came back with a 32-19-5 record, a .911 save percentage, and a 2.82 goals against average, which really is okay, but those are not solid numbers. So that's back-to-back regular seasons here that Braden Holtby has had subpar performances, in my opinion. Looking at their leading scorers, Alex Ovechkin once again led the way with 89 points. Nicholas Backstrom, 74 points. Evgeny Kuznetsov, 72. Defenseman John Carlson had another outstanding offensive season with 70 points. And TJ Oshie with 54. Now, of course, Oshie missed some time as well. Otherwise, those point totals likely would have been a little bit higher. Now, as far as any significant changes or trades that this team made throughout the year, there wasn't a whole lot of activity. Obviously, they had a few changes last offseason, especially with the head coach, Barry Trotz, leaving for Todd Reardon to take over here. But then, of course, they were quiet throughout most of the year until the deadline where they acquired defenseman Nick Jensen and forward Carl Hagelin, who both players certainly fit in relatively well. Now, let's jump over to segment 2, where we take a look at their salary cap situation and discuss any UFAs and RFAs. Now, the Washington Capitals do have a fair bit of contracts expiring this year. On the RFA front, they have Andrei Burakovsky, Dmitry Yaskin, Chandler Stevenson, Jacob Arena, and defenseman Christian Djoos. On the UFA front, they have Devontae Smith-Pelly, Carl Hagelin, Brett Connolly, and defenseman Brooks Orpik. Now, as far as who comes back and who doesn't, it's certainly debatable here. Looking at the RFA list, I do think there's a possibility all of these guys could be retained or qualified, although I would not be shocked to see, one or two of those guys possibly be traded, which we'll get into here in the next segment. From the UFA list, I think the only one that's likely to return, and it's really hard to say how likely, would be Brett Connolly. I think it's pretty safe to say that forwards Carl Hagelin and Devontae Smith-Pelly likely don't come back. We saw the Capitals put Smith-Pelly through the waiver wire and spend a big chunk of the year in the minors, so I don't think that they have much faith in him moving forward. I don't see him coming back. Carl Hagelin, even though he was useful for the Capitals and seemed to fit in okay, I'm not sure they're going to have the space to sign him. Brett Connolly had a pretty solid year. He's been steadily improving during his time in Washington, but the only concern with that is that he might end up pricing himself out of Washington. Hard to say. I would think they would probably like to retain him, but it's just debatable whether or not they can get that done. Defenseman Brooks Orpik, it's really debatable if he continues playing. Maybe sign a one-year contract with the Capitals, but I also think it's quite possible that he very well might call it quits here and call it a career. Looking at their overall cap situation, they have 16 contracts in place already for next year with a cap hit of $72.9 million, which gives them just a smidge over $10 million in space. So looking at all the players they have to sign, it certainly does make sense that they all won't be able to come back. They're going to have to make some changes here, whether it be through free agency or through trades, which we'll get into here in the next segment. So what do the Capitals need to do to get better for next year? Obviously, they're only 1 year removed from being the Stanley Cup champions, and then they became a first-round exit in the 2019 Stanley Cup Playoffs, which, like I said, we saw happen to all division winners. It really was the year of the wildcard teams, the year of the underdogs, even though really these wildcard teams are not that far off from a lot of the division winners. Parity is at an all-time high in the NHL, and when they say anybody can win, that really is the truth, and we've seen many examples of that this season. However, the Washington Capitals do need to shed some salary. They can't bring everybody back here. Like I said, $10 million in space. They have 16 contracts, so they need to add about anywhere from 6, 7, 8 players, and then $10 million is not a lot of money to do that with. So we're likely going to see 1 or 2 veteran players likely get moved out. I think one prime example that could accomplish some of that would be Matt Niskanen. Pretty solid defenseman, usually a second pair guy. I think the trade value for him certainly could be generated to bring in some picks or prospects in return. So I can see them maybe making a deal like that. Even with some of the RFAs, I can see Andre Burakovsky finally possibly being traded. He's been a player that's been talked about within the NHL rumor mill here for a number of months, really dating back to probably about the halfway point of this past season. Seems to be a player the Capitals have a lot of skill, but seem to get a little bit frustrated with on his development and his ability to kind of become a solid, consistent player. So I could see them possibly moving him as well. And if they don't have to sign him, then obviously that's going to create a little bit more of an opening as well. As I said, some of their UFAs likely don't come back. I do think there's a good possibility they would like to retain Brett Connolly, but because of how much he's improved and his goal scoring has been up, that he very well might price himself out of Washington and might be able to find himself a more valuable contract elsewhere. But you just never know. They very well might find a way to retain him. He's been an excellent player for them, and in a way it would be a shame to see him go. But at the same time, they might be able to use that money to bring in another younger player who can continue to put up similar type of numbers. Outside of Burakovsky, I do think it's quite likely that many of their other RFAs get signed. I don't think any of them are really earned big money deals, so signing them shouldn't be too difficult. But depending on what other cap space they are able to open up by trading a player like Niskanen, they might have to go down the route of making another bigger move here. Now, a deal that I've mentioned before that I would consider doing again is 1 of 2 guys I think could possibly be traded. Now, in my opinion here, I do think that they're likely going to have to trade more than just a Matt Niskanen to create some space here. They have $10 million right now, but looking at the number of contracts they have to do, I could see a player with a more significant contract be moved out. I think the likelihood here is 1 of 2 players. This is just an opinion of mine. I don't have any rumors or sources that indicate that they're considering doing this, but if I were the Capitals and I was GM Brian McClellan, I would really consider trading goaltender Braden Holtby. Now, Braden Holtby, as I mentioned, has had a couple of years of subpar regular seasons. He did come through when it mattered most last year in the playoffs and helped them win a Stanley Cup. So obviously, he really earned the right to come back and have another opportunity. But look at those numbers from this past season. Now, I realize it's not all just him. There's a team in front of him. But really, considering he's only a year away from being a pending free agent and considering where the cap situation is, they very well might be able to get a good enough return that trading him while he still has some value certainly could prove to be a good idea where they can look at adding to other areas of the team. The other player that I would consider trading, but I think is less likely, would be a Nicholas Backstrom. I don't see them trading Alex Ovechkin ever. I don't see Evgeny Kuznetsov being tradable or John Carlson. Those guys are your core guys. I see Kuznetsov as likely being, like the solid number 1 guy who can play with Ovechkin moving forward. So I do think Backstrom could be sacrificed here in order to free up more cap space. He doesn't have a lot of time left on his contract, and given the fact that he still remains very productive year after year, even though his production is down a bit from what it was a few years ago, ago, the production is still up high enough that he would still have a fair bit of trade value. Oftentimes, in my opinion, teams hang on to players too long, and they wait too long before their value ends up depleting too much and they don't get any kind of a return. A lot of these teams need to trade players before they get to the point where their production's down and they lose too much value. But I do really think it's less likely that they trade Backstrom. But in all honesty, I wonder if goaltender Ilya Samsonov could step in along with Copley to kind of hold down the fort in the net, and maybe trading Holtby could be a way to free up some additional cap space and really strengthen other areas of the team. Obviously, the past 2 regular seasons have been very successful for the Capitals, even having a subpar standard goaltender here in Holtby, who just hasn't been his best in recent years here. So if you're GM Brian McClellan, what moves do you make heading into the offseason here to get your team back to hopefully competing for another Stanley Cup? Would you consider making a bold move like trading goaltender Braden Holtby, possibly moving out a guy like Nicklas Backstrom? Or do you keep those guys, continue to build around them, maybe move out some smaller parts and replace them with younger players on entry-level contracts to try to balance out your salary cap situation? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section and we can continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel here, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty more content coming to finish off this series. The remaining teams will be covered here over the next few days, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.